James Rodriguez never imagined that sharing a simple turkey sandwich would expose a web of secrets spanning 3 decades. When he spotted the hungry boy digging through garbage outside the gleaming corporate tower where he worked nights as a janitor, something deep in his father's heart compelled him to offer his only meal. What James didn't know was that 60 floors above, CEO Victoria Carter was watching every moment unfold through her corner office window. What she would discover about that boy's identity would shake the very foundation of her billion-dollar empire and force her to confront a family secret she'd buried for 25 years. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The autumn rain hammered against the towering glass facade of Carter Industries, each droplet catching the harsh fluorescent lights that illuminated the empty corporate plaza. James Rodriguez pulled his worn jacket tighter as he stepped out of the service entrance, his weathered hands gripping the brown paper bag that contained his dinner. A simple turkey sandwich he'd assembled from yesterday's leftover grocery store deli meat and a heel of bread that was starting to go stale. At 42, James had learned to stretch every dollar until it screamed for mercy. His paycheck from the overnight janitorial service barely covered rent for the cramped 2-bedroom apartment he shared with his 8-year-old daughter, Maria, and the mounting medical bills from her asthma treatments seemed to multiply like weeds after every rain. The weight of exhaustion pressed down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd been working double shifts for the past 3 weeks, cleaning office buildings downtown during the night and picking up construction cleanup work during the day whenever he could find it. Sleep had become a luxury he couldn't afford, snatched in 2-hour increments between jobs and school pickup times. His body ached in places he'd forgotten existed, and the constant worry about money had carved permanent lines around his dark eyes. James found his usual spot on the concrete steps leading up to the main entrance of Carter Industries, a place where the security cameras didn't reach and the night guards rarely bothered to patrol. The building's imposing architecture rose above him like a monument to wealth and power, its sleek glass surface reflecting the city lights in a way that made it seem almost alive. Somewhere in those upper floors, behind walls lined with expensive artwork and mahogany furniture, people made decisions that affected thousands of lives without ever considering the human cost. He unwrapped his sandwich slowly, trying to make the anticipation last longer than the actual meal would. The turkey was dry, and the bread was starting to curl at the edges, but it was food, and food meant survival for another day. As he lifted the sandwich to his mouth, movement in his peripheral vision made him pause. Across the plaza, near the decorative fountain that had been turned off for the season, a small figure was hunched over a garbage can, tiny arms reaching deep into the metal container. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, maybe 11 at the most, with shoulder-length dark hair that hung in greasy tangles around a face that was gaunt with hunger. His clothes were several sizes too large, a faded denim jacket that had seen better decades, and jeans with holes at both knees. Even from a distance, James could see the boy's ribs pressing against the thin fabric of his shirt as he bent forward, searching desperately through the refuse for anything edible. Something twisted in James's chest, a familiar ache that came whenever he saw children suffering. It was the same feeling he'd experienced when Maria had asked why they couldn't afford the name-brand cereal at the grocery store, or when she'd quietly stopped mentioning the field trips at school because she knew they couldn't afford the fees. The boy at the garbage can moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been scavenging for survival longer than any child should have to. James looked down at his sandwich, then back at the boy. His stomach growled audibly, a reminder that he hadn't eaten since the previous morning, but the sound seemed insignificant compared to the sight of that small figure picking through trash with desperate determination. Without allowing himself to think about the decision, James stood up and walked across the plaza, his footsteps echoing off the surrounding buildings. "Hey there," James called out softly when he was still several feet away, not wanting to startle the boy. The child's head snapped up immediately, dark eyes wide with fear, and ready to bolt. James could see now that the boy's face was streaked with dirt and tears, his lips chapped and bleeding from cold and malnutrition. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you. Are you hungry?" The boy straightened slowly, his body tensed like a coiled spring ready to run at the first sign of danger. James had seen that look before, in the eyes of stray dogs that had been kicked too many times, in the faces of homeless people who had learned that kindness often came with strings attached. The boy's gaze darted between James's face and the sandwich in his hands, hope and suspicion warring in his expression. "I don't have any money," the boy whispered, his voice hoarse and small. Up close, James could see that he was even thinner than he'd appeared from a distance, his wrists like twigs poking out from the oversized sleeves of his jacket. "I wasn't stealing anything from the building. I was just looking for bottles to recycle." "I know," James said gently, taking a slow step closer. "I'm not asking for money. I'm asking if you're hungry because I have this sandwich here, and I think you need it more than I do." He held up the brown paper bag, trying to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "Turkey and cheese on white bread. Nothing fancy, but it's fresh enough." The boy's eyes fixed on the bag with an intensity that made James's heart break. "Why?" the child asked, suspicion still evident in his voice. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," James replied honestly. "I have a daughter about your age, and if she were out here alone and hungry, I'd hope someone would help her." He took another step closer, close enough now to see that the boy's shoes were held together with duct tape and that his jacket was missing most of its buttons. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated for a long moment, studying James's face as if trying to read his intentions. Finally, he whispered, "David. David Spencer. Nice to meet you, David. I'm James." He extended the bag toward the boy, watching as David's trembling hand reached out to accept it. "Are you out here by yourself? Where are your parents?" David clutched the bag to his chest, like it was made of gold, his eyes already filling with tears of relief. "My mom died last month," he said quietly. "She got sick and couldn't afford the medicine anymore. We lost our apartment after that, and I've been staying in different places, trying to find somewhere safe." The words hit James like a physical blow. This child had been surviving on the streets for weeks, sleeping in abandoned buildings and doorways, scrounging for food in garbage cans while social services remained unaware of his existence. James felt a rage building in his chest, not at David, but at a system that could allow a child to fall through the cracks so completely. "What about other family?" James asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Grandparents, aunts, uncles, anyone who could help?" David shook his head, unwrapping the sandwich with hands that shook from more than just cold. "My mom said my father was never around. She never told me much about her family either, just that they didn't approve of her choices." He took a bite of the sandwich, and James watched as the boy's eyes closed in pure gratitude. "This is the best thing I've tasted in weeks." James sat down on the edge of the fountain, gesturing for David to join him. The boy hesitated for a moment, then settled beside him, maintaining enough distance to run if necessary, but close enough to feel some semblance of human connection. "How have you been surviving out here? It's been getting cold at night. There's this abandoned building about 6 blocks from here," David explained between bites, devouring the sandwich with the desperate hunger of someone who didn't know when their next meal might come. "Some of the windows are boarded up, but there's a room in the basement where the heat from the pipes keeps it a little warmer. I have some blankets I found, and I try to stay hidden during the day so the police don't find me." "David, you can't keep living like this," James said gently. "It's not safe for a kid your age to be on the streets alone. Have you thought about going to social services? They have programs to help children in your situation." The boy's expression immediately hardened, and he pulled the jacket tighter around his shoulders. "No way. I've heard what happens to kids in the system. Foster homes where they just want the money from the state. Group homes where bigger kids beat you up and steal your stuff. At least out here, I only have to worry about taking care of myself." James understood the fear in David's voice, even if he disagreed with the boy's reasoning. The stories that circulated about the foster care system weren't always accurate, but there were enough real horror stories to make any child wary. Still, the alternative, a 10-year-old boy living on the streets through winter, was unthinkable. "Listen," James said carefully. "I know we just met, but I want you to know that if you ever need help, if you're in danger or you need food, you can find me here most nights around this time. I work in that building as a janitor, and I usually take my dinner break right here on these steps." David looked up at James with eyes that seemed far older than they should have been, as if the last few weeks had aged him years in a matter of days. "You would really help me? Even though you don't know me?" "Everyone deserves help when they need it," James replied. "Especially kids. And especially kids who are brave enough to survive what you've been through." 60 floors above them, Victoria Carter stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, her perfectly manicured hand pressed against the cold glass as she watched the scene unfold in the plaza below. At 55, Victoria had built Carter Industries from a modest real estate company into a diversified empire worth over $2 billion. Her office reflected her success, decorated with original paintings worth more than most people's houses and furniture that had been handcrafted by artisans whose waiting lists stretched for years. Victoria had been working late, reviewing quarterly reports and preparing for a board meeting the following morning, when movement in the plaza caught her attention. She'd watched as her night janitor, a man she'd seen around the building but never spoken to, directly, offered his own meal to a homeless child. The gesture had stopped her cold, not because it was unusual to see homeless people in the downtown area, but because something about the boy's profile, the way he held his head, the shape of his shoulders, triggered a memory she'd spent 25 years trying to forget. She pressed a button on her desk intercom, connecting her to the security office in the building's basement. "This is Carter. I need you to pull up the personnel file for the janitor on shift tonight." Hispanic male, early 40s, about 6 feet tall. "Yes, ma'am," came the voice of the night security supervisor. "That would be James Rodriguez. He's been with the cleaning service for about 2 years. Excellent employee record. Never missed a shift. I want a full background check on Rodriguez by tomorrow morning," Victoria instructed. "Employment history, family status, criminal record if any. Everything we can legally obtain." "Of course, Miss Carter. May I ask if there's been some kind of incident?" Victoria's eyes remained fixed on the plaza below, where James was now sitting beside the boy, both of them sharing what appeared to be a quiet conversation. "No incident. Just due diligence." After ending the call, Victoria remained at the window, studying the boy's features with growing unease. The resemblance was probably just her imagination, she told herself. Thousands of children lived on the streets, in the city, and the odds of this particular child having any connection to her family were astronomical. But as she watched the boy's animated gestures as he spoke to James, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking at a ghost from her past. Victoria's mind drifted back to 1998, to her younger sister Catherine, and the fight that had torn their family apart. Catherine had been 20 July, 2 then, fresh out of college, and full of idealistic dreams about changing the world. She'd wanted to use her trust fund to start a nonprofit organization helping underprivileged children, while Victoria, already running the family business, had argued that charity was fine but shouldn't come at the expense of sound financial planning. The argument had escalated when Catherine announced she was pregnant and refused to name the father, insisting that she could raise the child on her own. Victoria had tried to convince her sister to be practical, to consider adoption or at least marriage to provide stability for the child. But Catherine had accused Victoria of caring more about the family reputation than her happiness. The final blow came when their parents threatened to cut Catherine off financially if she didn't handle the situation appropriately. Catherine had packed her bags that same night, taking only what she could carry, and leaving behind a letter saying she never wanted to see any of them again. Victoria had tried to find her sister several times over the years, but Catherine had disappeared completely, changing her name and leaving no forwarding address. Now, as Victoria watched the homeless boy carefully wrap the remainder of his sandwich for later, she found herself calculating dates and ages. If Catherine had kept the baby, the child would be 26 now, but Victoria knew her sister could have had other children later. The boy in the plaza looked to be about 10 years old, which would put his birth year around 2014, give or teen. It was possible, though Victoria tried to convince herself it was just coincidence. The boy stood up from the fountain, shaking James's hand with a formality that seemed oddly mature for someone so young. Victoria watched as James wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it to the boy. probably his phone number or some way to contact him. The interaction was brief, but meaningful. And Victoria found herself admiring the janitor's compassion, even as she wrestled with her own conflicted emotions about the scene she'd witnessed. As the boy disappeared into the shadows between buildings, James gathered up the empty paper bag and returned to his position on the steps. Victoria could see him settling back into his routine, but his posture had changed. Instead of the weary slump of exhaustion she'd noticed earlier, his shoulders were straighter, as if the act of helping another person had somehow recharged his own spirit. Victoria turned away from the window and walked to her desk, where framed photographs of corporate achievements and industry awards lined the polished surface. Nowhere among them was there a single family photo. No images of parents or siblings or children of her own. She'd built her empire at the cost of personal relationships, convincing herself that business success was more important than emotional connections. The next cough. Morning arrived gray and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made the city feel smaller and more claustrophobic. James had managed to catch 3 hours of sleep before his alarm jolted him awake, and he moved through his morning routine with the mechanical efficiency of someone running on autopilot. Maria chattered happily over her breakfast of generic cereal and powdered milk, telling him about a science project she was excited to present to her class. "Papa, do you think you could come to the presentation?" she asked, her dark eyes hopeful. "It's on Friday afternoon at 2 o'clock. I'm doing mine on recycling and how it helps the environment." James felt the familiar stab of guilt that came whenever Maria asked him to attend school events. His work schedule made it almost impossible to be present for the normal milestones of her childhood, and he hated disappointing her, even though he had no choice. "I'll try, mija," he said, kissing the top of her head. "But you know how unpredictable my work can be. If I can't make it, I want you to do your very best presentation anyway, okay?" "I always do my best," Maria replied with the matter-of-fact confidence of childhood. Mrs. S. Gonzalez says I'm one of her smartest students, and that I should think about applying for the gifted program next year. The pride James felt in his daughter's academic achievements was tempered by the knowledge that gifted programs often required additional resources he couldn't provide. Advanced classes meant more expensive supplies, educational trips, and extracurricular activities that stretched their already tight budget beyond its limits. Still, he refused to let his financial limitations become barriers to Maria's potential. "That's wonderful, baby girl. You keep working hard in school, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." After dropping Maria off at her elementary school, James drove his 15-year-old pickup truck to a construction site on the other side of town, where he'd picked up a day job helping with cleanup after a renovation project. The work was backbreaking, hauling debris and scrubbing paint splatters off windows, but it paid cash and didn't ask questions about his lack of formal construction experience. Throughout the day, as he worked under the supervision of the project foreman, James found his thoughts drifting back to David Spencer. The boy's thin face and hollow eyes haunted him, bringing back memories of his own childhood in El Paso, where his mother had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table after his father abandoned the family. James remembered the gnawing hunger that came with poverty, the shame of wearing clothes that didn't fit properly, and the constant worry about whether there would be enough money to pay the rent. During his lunch break, James sat in his truck and tried to eat a peanut butter sandwich, but his appetite had disappeared. He kept thinking about David sleeping in an abandoned building, scavenging for food in garbage cans, and trying to stay invisible to avoid being caught by authorities who might separate him from the little control he had over his own survival. James pulled out his phone and spent several minutes researching local resources for homeless youth. The options were limited and often came with waiting lists or bureaucratic requirements that could take weeks to navigate. Emergency shelters were overcrowded and typically only provided temporary housing, while long-term foster placements required extensive background checks and court proceedings that could leave a child in limbo for months. By the time James arrived at Carter Industries that evening for his janitorial shift, he'd made a decision that both terrified and energized him. He would find David again and offer him something more substantial than a sandwich, even if it meant taking risks he couldn't afford to take. The boy needed help, and James was in a position to provide it, even if his resources were limited. Victoria Carter had spent the day in back-to-back meetings, but her mind kept wandering to the scene she'd witnessed the night before. The background check on James Rodriguez had arrived that morning, revealing a man with an impeccable employment record, no criminal history, and a reputation among his supervisors as reliable and hard-working. He was a single father, raising a daughter alone, with no family support and financial circumstances that put him just above the poverty line. More interestingly, the report included character references from previous employers who described James as the kind of person who went out of his way to help colleagues and customers, often at his own expense. One former supervisor had noted that James frequently stayed late without additional pay to help train new employees, and another mentioned that he'd organized food drives for co-workers who'd fallen on hard times. The information painted a picture of a man whose generosity extended far beyond the single act of kindness Victoria had witnessed, someone who made helping others a consistent pattern rather than an occasional gesture. It was a level of selflessness that Victoria found both admirable and difficult to understand, having spent most of her adult life in corporate environments where personal advancement took precedence over community support. That evening, Victoria found herself working late again, though she completed most of her urgent tasks hours earlier. She told herself she was catching up on industry reports and preparing for upcoming negotiations, but in reality, she was waiting to see if James would encounter the homeless boy again. Her corner office provided a perfect vantage point for observing the plaza, and she'd positioned herself at the windows with a cup of coffee and a stack of documents she'd already read twice. At exactly 8:15, James emerged from the service entrance and took his usual position on the concrete steps. Victoria watched as he unwrapped what appeared to be a larger meal than the previous night, a sandwich accompanied by an apple and what looked like a bag of chips. She realized he'd probably brought extra food in case he encountered David again, sacrificing his own nutritional needs to help a child he'd met only once. 20 minutes passed before David appeared, emerging from the shadows with the cautious approach of someone who'd learned to be wary of every situation. Even from 60 floors up, Victoria could see the boy's reluctance as he approached James, his body language suggesting he was ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. The reunion between James and David appeared to be warmer than their initial meeting, with David accepting the offered food more readily and settling beside James on the fountain ledge without the defensive posturing he'd ever displayed the night before. Victoria found herself leaning closer to the window, trying to read their body language and wishing she could hear their conversation. As the two figures sat together in the plaza, sharing the simple meal and what appeared to be easy conversation, Victoria felt an unexpected emotion stirring in her chest. It took her several minutes to identify the feeling as longing, not for wealth or business success, but for the kind of human connection she witnessed between the janitor and the homeless boy. James had nothing to gain from helping David, no strategic advantage or financial benefit, yet he was investing time and resources he could barely afford to spare. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from her personal assistant, reminding her about a charity gala the following evening where she'd be presenting a check for $50,000 to a local children's organization. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could write a check large enough to transform dozens of young lives, yet she felt disconnected from the actual impact of her philanthropy. Her charitable giving was tax-deductible, publicly visible, and carefully managed by her public relations team to enhance Carter Industries' corporate image. In contrast, James's generosity was anonymous, costly given his limited income, and motivated purely by empathy rather than strategic considerations. Victoria realized she envied him, not for his financial situation, but for the authentic human connections he seemed to form effortlessly. As she watched James and David finish their meal and begin what appeared to be a more serious conversation, Victoria made an impulse decision that surprised even her. She picked up her phone and dialed the direct number for Marcus Webb, the private investigator she'd used occasionally for sensitive corporate matters. "Marcus, it's Victoria Carter. I need you to conduct a discreet investigation for me, and I want to emphasize the word discreet. There's a homeless boy, approximately 10 years old, first name David. Last name Spencer. He's been seen in the downtown area near my building. I want to know everything about his background, family history, how he ended up on the streets, and what resources might be available to help him. "That's an unusual request, Victoria," Marcus replied. "May I ask what your interest is in this particular child?" Victoria hesitated, unsure how to explain her motivations without revealing her suspicions about David's possible connection to her family. "Let's just say I witnessed something that made me want to help, and I believe in doing proper research before taking action. I want a full report within 48 hours, and I want this kept completely confidential." After ending the call, Victoria remained at the window until James and David parted ways, with David disappearing once again into the maze of downtown streets. James returned to his cleaning duties inside the building, and Victoria finally gathered her things to leave for the evening, though her mind remained focused on the questions surrounding the boy's identity and circumstances. The following night, Victoria found herself in the same position at her office window, though this time she'd canceled a dinner meeting to ensure she'd be available to observe James's routine. The private investigator's preliminary report had arrived that afternoon, and its contents had shaken her more than she'd expected. David Spencer's mother had indeed been named Catherine, though she'd been using the last name Spencer rather than Carter when she died. The boy had been living with his mother in a subsidized apartment until her death from complications related to diabetes, a condition she'd been unable to manage properly due to lack of insurance and limited access to medical care. After Catherine's death, David had spent 2 weeks in emergency foster placement before running away, preferring life on the streets to an overcrowded group home where he'd been bullied and had his few possessions stolen. The report also included a photograph of Catherine Spencer, taken from a hospital admissions record, and Victoria's breath had caught in her throat when she saw it. Despite 25 years of separation and the ravages of poverty and illness, the woman in the photograph was unmistakably her sister. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn set of the jaw, the same delicate bone structure that had made Catherine the beauty of the family during their childhood. David Spencer wasn't just any homeless child. He was Victoria's nephew, the grandson of parents who died without ever knowing they had a descendant living in poverty just miles from the family estate. Victoria's sister had kept her promise to never contact the family again, but she'd also been too proud to ask for help even when her son's life depended on it. The knowledge that David was family changed everything, and nothing simultaneously. Victoria felt a crushing guilt over her sister's death and her nephew's circumstances, but she also felt paralyzed by the complexity of the situation. She couldn't simply approach David and announce that she was his aunt, not when the boy had every reason to distrust adults and their promises of help. As she watched James emerge for his evening break, Victoria realized that the janitor had become an unwitting bridge between her and David. The boy trusted James in a way he might never trust a wealthy stranger, and James had demonstrated a genuine commitment to David's welfare that went beyond mere charity. Any plan to help David would need to include James as a central figure, which meant Victoria would need to find a way to approach the janitor without revealing her true identity or compromising David's trust. James arrived at his usual spot, carrying an even larger bag of food than the previous nights, and Victoria suspected he'd been spending an increasing portion of his limited income on meals for David. The gesture was both generous and unsustainable, as Victoria knew from the background report that James was already stretched financially to his breaking point. David appeared more quickly than on previous nights, suggesting he'd been waiting nearby for James to arrive. The boy seemed more relaxed as he approached, his posture less defensive, and his movements more confident. Victoria watched as the two settled into what was clearly becoming a routine, sharing food and conversation like old friends, despite having known each other for only 3 days. This time, their conversation appeared more intense, with James gesturing toward the building, and David shaking his head vigorously. Victoria suspected James was trying to convince David to seek more formal help, while David was resisting any suggestions that might lead to involvement with social services. The debate continued for several minutes before David suddenly stood up and began backing away from James, his defensive posture returning. James rose as well, his hands extended in a calming gesture, but David was already retreating toward the shadows. Victoria watched as the boy paused at the edge of the plaza, torn between flight and the security he'd begun to feel with James. After a moment, David returned to the fountain, but his body language remained tense and ready for escape. The interaction troubled Victoria because it suggested that David's situation was becoming more precarious rather than more stable. Winter was approaching, and a 10-year-old boy couldn't survive indefinitely on the streets, no matter how resourceful or street-smart he might be. The longer David remained homeless, the greater the risk of serious harm, illness, or worse. Victoria made another impulsive decision, one that would require her to step outside her comfort zone of corporate boardrooms and carefully managed public appearances. She picked up her phone and dialed James Rodriguez's number, which she'd obtained from his employment file. James was surprised to receive a call on his personal phone during his break, especially from a number he didn't recognize. When he answered, the voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and vaguely familiar. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Victoria Carter from Carter Industries. I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I wanted to speak with you about a matter of mutual interest." James felt his stomach drop, assuming he was about to be fired for some infraction he wasn't aware of. He'd been careful to maintain his professional standards and complete all his assigned duties, but working for a large corporation meant there were always policies and procedures he might have inadvertently violated. "Ms. Carter, I hope there hasn't been any problem with my work performance. I take my responsibilities very seriously, and if I've done something wrong, I'd appreciate the opportunity to correct it." "Actually, your work performance has been exemplary," Victoria replied. "I'm calling about something else entirely. I happened to notice that you've been helping a young homeless boy in our plaza over the past few nights, and I wanted to discuss how Carter Industries might be able to assist with that situation." James was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of his employer's awareness of his interactions with David. He'd assumed his evening breaks were unobserved, and he worried that his involvement with a homeless child might be seen as a liability or security risk. "Ma'am, I want to assure you that the boy hasn't been causing any trouble or damage to company property. He's just a kid who's hungry and alone. And I felt like I should help if I could. If you'd prefer that I handle my breaks differently, I understand." "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm not calling to criticize your actions. Quite the opposite, actually. I'm impressed by your compassion, and I think we might be able to work together to find a more comprehensive solution for this child's situation." Victoria paused, choosing her words carefully. She needed James's cooperation, but she couldn't reveal her personal connection to David without potentially complicating the situation further. Carter Industries has a corporate social responsibility program, and we're always looking for opportunities to support our community. I'd like to discuss how we might help this boy access proper resources while respecting his circumstances and your relationship with him. James felt a glimmer of hope, mixed with healthy skepticism. Corporate charity programs were often more about public relations than genuine assistance, and he'd learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. However, David's situation was becoming increasingly urgent, and James was running out of options for providing meaningful help on his own. "I appreciate your interest, Ms. Carter. But David, the boy, he's very distrustful of adults and institutions. He's been through some difficult experiences, and he's more likely to run away than accept help from strangers, even well-meaning ones." "I understand," Victoria replied. "That's why I think your continued involvement would be crucial to any successful intervention. You've already established trust with him, and that's not something that can be replicated or replaced easily." They arranged to meet the following morning before James's day shift in Victoria's office to discuss potential strategies for helping David. After ending the call, James felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the unexpected development. Corporate involvement could provide resources he could never access on his own, but it also meant introducing variables he couldn't control into an already delicate situation. Victoria spent the rest of the evening reviewing everything she knew about David's circumstances and considering various approaches to revealing her identity and offering assistance. The situation was complicated by years of family estrangement, David's traumatic recent experiences, and the delicate trust he'd developed with James. Any misstep could drive the boy deeper underground, potentially beyond reach of help entirely. The next morning, James arrived at Carter Industries 30 minutes early, wearing his only dress shirt and a tie he'd borrowed from his neighbor. He'd never been above the ground floor of the building where he worked, and riding the elevator to the 60th floor felt like traveling to another world entirely. The executive offices were decorated with an understated luxury that spoke of wealth beyond his comprehension, and he felt acutely aware of his worn shoes and second-hand clothing. Victoria's office was larger than James's entire apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a panoramic view of the city skyline. Victoria herself was younger than he'd expected, probably in her early 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair and the kind of composed confidence that came from years of wielding significant power. "Mr. Rodriguez, thank you for taking the time to meet with me," Victoria said, gesturing for him to take a seat in one of the leather chairs arranged around a small conference table. "I know this is unusual, and I appreciate your willingness to discuss David's situation." James settled into the chair, trying not to appear as intimidated as he felt. "I have to admit, I'm curious about why the CEO of a major corporation is personally interested in helping one homeless kid. Not that I'm complaining, but it seems like the kind of thing that would usually be handled by someone in your charitable foundation or public relations department." End quote. Victoria had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that was truthful without being complete. "You're right that this is outside my usual purview. However, I witnessed your interaction with David from my office window, and I was moved by your generosity. Sometimes personal experiences motivate us to become involved in ways that professional responsibilities don't." End quote. She opened a file folder on the table, revealing the private investigator's report on David's background and circumstances. "I took the liberty of researching David's situation, and what I found reinforced my belief that he needs help urgently. His mother died 6 weeks ago from complications related to diabetes, and he's been living on the streets ever since. He has no known family members, and his experience with emergency foster care was traumatic enough to make him prefer homelessness." End quote. James scanned the documents, his heart sinking as he read the details of David's recent losses and struggles. The clinical language of the report couldn't capture the emotional reality of a 10-year-old boy losing his mother and then being thrust into a system that failed to protect him, but the facts painted a clear picture of a, quote, "child in crisis." "This is worse than I thought," James said quietly. "David told me his mother had died, but he didn't give me details about how long he'd been on his own or what he'd been through before we met." The report also indicates that David is academically gifted. Victoria continued. "His school records show consistent high achievement until his mother became too ill to ensure regular attendance. With proper support and stability, he could have a bright future. But every day he spends on the streets increases the risk of permanent damage to his physical and emotional development." Victoria leaned forward, her expression serious. "I want to help David, but I need your guidance on the best approach. You've established a relationship with him, and any successful intervention will depend on maintaining his trust while gradually introducing additional resources and support." James considered Victoria's words carefully. Her offer seemed genuine, and her research demonstrated a level of commitment that went beyond casual charity. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were elements of the situation she wasn't sharing with him. "What exactly are you proposing?" James asked. "David has made it clear that he won't voluntarily enter the foster care system, and I can't say I blame him based on his experiences. Any solution would have to respect his autonomy while still ensuring his safety and well-being." "Why?" "I've been researching alternative approaches," Victoria replied, pulling out a second folder. "There are several options that might work better for David's specific situation. Emergency guardianship programs, kinship care arrangements, and specialized foster families trained to work with children who experience trauma." James nodded slowly, though he remained cautious. "Those sound like possibilities, but David would need to be willing to participate. He's been surviving on his own for weeks now, and in his mind, that proves he doesn't need adults making decisions for him." Victoria stood and walked to her window, gazing down at the plaza where James and David had shared their meals. "What if we could find a way to give David more control over his circumstances while still providing the support he needs? Someone who could offer stability without the institutional framework he's learned to fear?" To fear. Like what? "Bah," James asked, though he suspected he already knew where the conversation was heading. Victoria turned back to face him, her expression carefully neutral. What if someone were willing to become David's legal guardian? Someone who could provide a home environment while respecting his need for independence and his relationship with you. The suggestion hung in the air between them, and James felt his pulse quicken. The idea of taking responsibility for David was both appealing and terrifying. His own financial situation was precarious enough with just Maria to support, and adding another child to his household would strain resources that were already stretched beyond their limits. Ms. Carter, I appreciate what you're suggesting, but I barely make enough to support my own daughter. Taking on another child, especially one with David's complex needs, would be financially impossible for me. What if financial support were part of the arrangement? Victoria asked carefully. Carter Industries could provide a monthly stipend to cover David's living expenses, educational needs, and any counseling or medical care he might require. You would have full legal authority to make decisions about his welfare, but you wouldn't bear the financial burden alone. James stared at Victoria, trying to process the magnitude of what she was proposing. Corporate sponsorship of individual foster arrangements was virtually unheard of, and the level of financial commitment she was suggesting would represent a significant ongoing expense with no apparent benefit to her company. Why would Carter Industries make that kind of investment in one child? James asked bluntly. I understand corporate social responsibility programs, but this goes far beyond typical charitable giving. There has to be something you're not telling me. Victoria had hoped to avoid this moment of revelation, but James's directness made further deception impossible. She returned to her seat and opened a third folder, this one containing copies of birth certificates, hospital records, and family photographs dating back to the 1970s. David Spencer is my nephew, she said quietly. His mother was my younger sister Catherine, who disappeared from our family 25 years ago after a bitter disagreement. I've been searching for her periodically over the years, but she changed her name and left no forwarding information. I only discovered the connection when I had David investigated after seeing him with you in the plaza. The revelation hit James like a physical shock. The homeless boy he'd been feeding and befriending was related to one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in the city. The implications were staggering, both for David's future prospects and for the dynamics of the situation James had unknowingly entered. Does David know? James asked. Does he have any idea that he has family with the resources to help him? I don't believe so, Victoria replied. Catherine was estranged from our family before David was born, and based on what he told you about his mother never discussing relatives, I suspect she never mentioned us to him. Our last conversation was so acrimonious that she probably preferred to let him believe he had no extended family rather than risk him seeking us out. James absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the compassionate corporate executive sitting across from him with the kind of family conflict that could drive a pregnant woman to choose poverty and isolation. Over reconciliation. What happened between you and your sister? He asked. What could have been so serious that she'd rather raise a child in poverty than accept help from her family? Victoria's composure slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of the pain she'd carried for over 2 decades. Catherine was idealistic and stubborn, and I was pragmatic and controlling. She wanted to use her inheritance to start a nonprofit organization, while I believed she should invest it more conservatively. When she became pregnant and refused to reveal the father's identity, our parents pressured her to consider adoption or marriage. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I supported our parents' position because I thought Catherine was being irresponsible. I told her that single motherhood would be difficult, and that she should think practically about the child's future. Catherine accused me of caring more about family reputation than our happiness, and she wasn't entirely wrong. So she left to prove she could make it on her own, James said, understanding beginning to dawn. And she was too proud to come back when things got difficult. Catherine was always determined to prove that her way of doing things was right, Victoria said, even when it meant sacrificing her own well-being and, ultimately, David's security. I spent years wondering if I could have handled the situation differently, if there was something I could have said or done that would have kept our family together. James leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. David wasn't just a homeless child in need of help. He was the focal point of a family tragedy that had been unfolding for 25 years. Victoria's offer of guardianship support wasn't just corporate charity. It was an attempt to atone for past mistakes and reconnect with the only remaining link to her lost sister. "This changes everything," James said finally. "If David is your nephew, why not just tell him who you are and offer to take him in directly? You certainly have the resources to provide him with everything he could possibly need." Victoria shook her head. "David has spent weeks learning to survive independently, and he's developed a deep distrust of adults and institutions. If I approach him as a wealthy relative he's never met, making promises about family connections he's been told don't exist, he's likely to see it as another form of manipulation." She gestured toward the window. "You've seen how he responds to genuine kindness, offered without strings attached. He trusts you because you helped him when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. That trust is invaluable, and I don't want to jeopardize it by moving too quickly or appearing to have ulterior motives." James understood Victoria's reasoning, but he also recognized the ethical complexity of her proposal. She was asking him to become David's legal guardian while concealing her identity and family connection, essentially using James as a proxy to care for her nephew without David's knowledge. "What happens when David eventually learns the truth?" James asked. "Because eventually he will find out, and when he does, he's going to feel betrayed by both of us. He'll think we conspired to deceive him, even if our intentions were good." "I've thought about that," Victoria admitted. "My hope is that by the time David learns about our family connection, he'll have established enough stability and trust with you to understand that our deception was motivated by concern for his well-being rather than any desire to manipulate him." The plan was risky and ethically ambiguous, but James couldn't ignore the potential benefits for David. The boy needed immediate help, and Victoria's resources could provide opportunities that would otherwise be impossible. A stable home, quality education, medical care, and emotional support could transform David's life trajectory in ways that street survival never could. "I need time to think about this," James said. "And I need to discuss it with David, without revealing your identity for now, to see how he feels about the possibility of living with me and Maria." "Of course," Victoria agreed. "Take all the time you need. David's safety and well-being are the priority, and any decision we make needs to be one that serves his best interests in the long term." As James prepared to leave, Victoria added, "There's one more thing you should know. I've arranged for David to have access to emergency medical care and temporary housing if needed, regardless of what decision we make about guardianship. I won't let him spend another night on the streets if there's an alternative, even if he's not ready to accept a permanent solution." That evening, James approached his meeting with David with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The boy appeared more promptly than usual, and James noticed that he seemed slightly healthier than he had a few days earlier. Regular meals, even simple ones, had begun to restore some color to David's pale complexion, though he still carried the wary alertness of someone who'd learned that safety was always temporary. "I brought extra tonight," James said, offering David a bag that contained 2 sandwiches, fruit, and a thermos of hot soup. "I thought you might be able to save some for breakfast tomorrow." David accepted the food gratefully, settling beside James on the fountain edge with the familiarity of routine. "James, can I ask you something?" the boy said between bites of sandwich. "Why do you keep helping me? I mean, I'm grateful, but most adults either ignore homeless kids or call the police. You're different." James considered his answer carefully, knowing that his response might influence David's receptiveness to future suggestions about his living situation. "When I was growing up, my family didn't have much money. There were times when we relied on the kindness of neighbors and strangers to get by. I learned that sometimes the smallest gestures can make the biggest difference in someone's life." "Did you ever live on the streets?" David asked. "No. I was fortunate to always have a roof over my head, even if it wasn't always a very good roof," James replied. "But I remember what it felt like to be hungry, to worry about whether there would be enough money for rent, to feel like the world was a place where I didn't quite belong." David nodded, understanding the connection between their experiences despite the differences in their circumstances. My mom used to say that people who've been through hard times are more likely to help others who are struggling. She said it's because they remember what it feels like to need help. The mention of David's mother provided an opening for the conversation James needed to have. David, I've been thinking about your situation, and I'm worried about what's going to happen when winter gets here. It's already getting cold at night, and it's only going to get worse. David's posture immediately became defensive. I'll be fine. I know how to stay warm, and I've found places to shelter when the weather is really bad. I've been taking care of myself for weeks now. I know you have, and I'm impressed by how resourceful and brave you've been, James said carefully. But surviving and thriving are two different things. You deserve more than just getting by from day to day. What are you suggesting? David asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would determine the direction of their relationship. What would you think about coming to stay with me and my daughter? Not permanently, not unless you wanted to, but just until we could figure out a better long-term solution. David stared at James in shock, clearly not having expected such an offer. You would do that? You would let a stranger live in your house with your daughter? You're not a stranger anymore, David. You're a friend, and friends help each other when they can. The boy was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of James's offer. What about your daughter? What does she think about having a homeless kid move into her home? Maria doesn't know about you yet, James admitted, but I think she would be excited to have a friend close to her own age. She's been asking me for a brother or sister for years, though I never thought it would happen quite like this. David's eyes filled with tears, though he tried to hide them by looking down at his food. What if it doesn't work out? What if I do something wrong, or you decide you don't want me around anymore? I'd be back to sleeping in abandoned buildings. Except now, I'd know what I was missing. That won't happen, James said firmly. If you decide to try living with us, it will be with the understanding that you have a place there for as long as you need it. No conditions, no temporary arrangements that could be canceled on a whim. But you barely know me, David protested. What if I'm more trouble than you expect? What if I have problems you can't handle? James reached out and placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder. Everyone has problems, David. Adults, kids, families, everyone. The difference between being alone and being part of a family is that when you're part of a family, you don't have to handle your problems by yourself. David looked up at James with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face. If I said yes, when would this happen? And could I change my mind if I needed to? We could start whenever you're ready, James replied. Tonight, if you want. Or we could plan for this weekend so you have time to think about it. And yes, you could change your mind at any time. This would be your decision, and you'd have the right to make different decisions if your feelings changed. The boy sat quietly for a long time, staring out at the city lights that stretched beyond the plaza. Finally, he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. I'm scared, James. I've been taking care of myself for so long that I don't remember what it's like to depend on other people. What if I've forgotten how to be part of a family? Being part of a family isn't something you forget, James said gently. It's something you learn and relearn every day. Maria and I are still figuring out how to be a family ourselves, and we could use some help with that. David smiled for the first time since James had known him, a real smile that transformed his entire face. Okay, he said. I want to try. I'm still scared, but I think I'd rather be scared in a warm house with people who care about me than scared on the streets by myself. 3 days later, Victoria watched from her office window as James and David approached the building together, David carrying a small backpack that contained all his worldly possessions. The boy looked nervous but determined, and his trust in James was evident in the way he stayed close to the older man's side. Victoria's phone rang, and she saw James's number on the display. Ms. Carter, this is James Rodriguez. David has agreed to come and stay with my family, and we're ready to begin the legal guardianship process. That's wonderful news. Victoria replied, though her voice was carefully controlled to hide her emotional response to seeing her nephew about to enter a safe and loving home for the first time in months. I've already spoken with Family Court Services, and they're prepared to expedite the paperwork given David's circumstances. There's one more thing, James said. David is curious about the corporate sponsorship aspect of this arrangement. He's a smart kid, and he understands that taking care of an additional child costs money. I've explained that Carter Industries has agreed to help with expenses, but he wants to know why your company would make that kind of investment. Victoria had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer that was honest, without revealing her family connection. You can tell David that Carter Industries believes in investing in exceptional young people who show promise for future success. His academic records and his resilience in difficult circumstances suggest that he has the potential to achieve great things with proper support. End quote. Will you want to meet him at some point? James asked. He's expressed interest in thanking the person who made this arrangement possible. Eventually, yes, Victoria said. But let's give him time to adjust to his new living situation first. The transition from homelessness to family life will be challenging enough without adding additional complications. After ending the call, Victoria remained at her window until James and David disappeared into the building. She knew they were heading to the Human Resources office to complete employment paperwork that would provide James with additional insurance coverage and benefits that would help support David's needs. That evening, Victoria drove to a modest neighborhood across town where James lived with his daughter. She parked a discreet distance from their apartment building and watched as lights came on in the windows of what she assumed was their unit. She couldn't see inside, but she imagined David experiencing his first home-cooked meal in months, perhaps helping with household chores or homework, beginning to understand what it meant to be part of a family again. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message from James. David is settling in well. Maria is thrilled to have a big brother, and David seems amazed by simple things like having his own bed and being able to take a hot shower whenever he wants. Thank you for making this possible. The message was followed by a photograph that took Victoria's breath away. David and Maria were sitting at a small kitchen table, working on homework together, both of them smiling. David's face had already lost some of the gaunt desperation that had marked his appearance on the streets, and he looked like what he was, a normal 10-year-old boy who happened to be exceptionally bright and resilient. Victoria stared at the photograph for a long time, studying David's features and seeing echoes of her sister Catherine in his expressions and gestures. This was what Catherine had wanted for her son, a loving family environment where he could thrive academically and emotionally. Unfortunately, Catherine's pride and their family's rigidity had prevented her from providing that stability herself. Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself eagerly awaiting James's regular updates about David's progress. The boy was excelling in his new school, having been placed in accelerated classes that challenged his intellectual capabilities. He'd made friends quickly and had joined the school's science club, where his curiosity and analytical thinking were greatly appreciated by teachers and peers alike. More importantly, David seemed to be healing emotionally from the trauma of his recent experiences. James reported that the nightmares that had plagued David during his first week in their home were becoming less frequent, and that the boy was beginning to talk more openly about his feelings and concerns. He asked me yesterday if this was permanent, James told Victoria during one of their weekly check-in calls. I told him that as far as I was concerned, he was part of our family for as long as he wanted to be, but I think he's still afraid that it's too good to be true. That's understandable, given what he's been through, Victoria replied. It will probably take months for him to fully believe that his security isn't temporary. The important thing is that he's beginning to experience what normal family life feels like. There's something else, James said. David has started asking questions about his extended family. He knows his mother never talked about relatives, but he's curious about whether there might be grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins somewhere. I've been telling him that we might be able to research his family history once he's more settled, but I wanted to get your thoughts on how to handle those questions. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but she still felt unprepared for the complexity of revealing her identity to David. What kind of questions is he asking specifically? He wants to know if his mother might have had siblings, and whether there might be family members who would want to know about him. He's also curious about his father, though he seems less hopeful about finding paternal relatives. I think we should wait a little longer before addressing those questions directly, Victoria said carefully. Let him get more comfortable with his current situation before we introduce additional variables that might complicate his emotional adjustment. 6 months after David had moved in with James's family, Victoria finally felt ready to take the next step in revealing her connection to her nephew. David had thrived in his new environment, gaining weight and confidence while maintaining his academic excellence and developing close friendships with classmates and neighbors. Victoria arranged to meet James at a coffee shop near his apartment building, in a setting that was less formal than her corporate office. She arrived early and chose a corner table where they could speak privately without being overheard by other customers. When James arrived, Victoria could see the positive changes that stable family life had brought to his own circumstances. The constant stress lines around his eyes had softened, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who felt he was making a meaningful difference in the world. "How is David doing with the idea of researching his family history?" Victoria asked after they'd exchanged greetings and ordered coffee. "He's still very interested," James replied. "In fact, he started doing some preliminary research on his own using the computers at school. He found his mother's birth certificate online and discovered that she was born Catherine Carter, not Catherine Spencer as Asta. He'd believed." Victoria's stomach clenched. David was closer to discovering the truth than she'd realized, and he was approaching it from an angle she hadn't anticipated. What did he make of that information? He was confused at first, but he figured out that Spencer might have been a name his mother adopted later in life. "He asked me to help him research the Carter family to see if there were any relatives he might be able to contact." "And what did you tell him?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I told him we could work on that research together," James said. "I figured it was better to guide his investigation than to let him stumble onto information that might be difficult for him to process on his own." Victoria nodded, understanding that the time for deception had passed. David was actively searching for his family connections, and it would be better for him to learn the truth from people he trusted, rather than discover it accidentally through internet searches or public records. "James, I think it's time to tell David who I am," Victoria said. "He's stable enough now to handle the information, and he has the right to know that he has family who cares about him." "How do you want to approach it?" James asked. "This is going to be a lot for him to process, and I want to make sure we handle it in a way that doesn't undermine his sense of security." Victoria had been considering various approaches for weeks, trying to find a balance between honesty and sensitivity to David's emotional needs. "I think you should tell him first, in familiar surroundings with you and Maria present for support. Once he's had time to process the information, I'd like to meet him properly and begin building a relationship as his aunt." "What about the financial arrangements?" James asked. "David is going to realize that you've been supporting his care this whole time without his knowledge. He might feel like we've been deceiving him, even though our intentions were good." "We'll deal with that together," Victoria said. "The important thing is that David understands that every decision we've made has been focused on his well-being and his right to choose his own path. He's never been a charity case or a corporate responsibility project. He's been a beloved family member who was finally coming home." That evening, James sat down with David and Maria in their living room, a space that had become synonymous with safety and belonging for all of them. David was working on a science project about renewable energy, while Maria practiced piano scales on the keyboard Victoria had purchased for the family as an anonymous gift. "David, I need to talk with you about something important," James said, gesturing for the boy to join him on the couch. "It's about the family research you've been doing, and about some things I haven't told you yet because I was waiting for the right time." David immediately set aside his homework, his expression becoming serious. Over the months of living with James's family, he'd learned to recognize when adult conversations required his full attention. "Remember when we first talked about you coming to live with us, and I mentioned that Carter Industries was providing financial support?" James began. "You were curious about why a corporation would make that kind of investment in helping one child." "I remember," David said. "You said they believed in investing in young people with potential, but I always thought there had to be more to it than that." James took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change David's understanding of his own identity and history. "The CEO of Carter Industries, Victoria Carter, is your aunt. She's your mother's older sister." David stared at James in stunned silence. his mind struggling to process the implications of this revelation. My aunt? But my mother said we didn't have any family. She always told me it was just the two of us against the world. Your mother and Victoria had a serious disagreement many years ago, before you were born, James explained gently. They lost contact with each other, and your mother chose not to tell you about her family because the separation was so painful for her. So Victoria Carter, one of the richest people in the city, is my aunt? David asked, his voice rising with a mixture of disbelief and anger. She's been alive this whole time, living in luxury while my mother was sick and we were struggling to pay for medicine and food? James had anticipated this reaction and had prepared himself to help David work through the complex emotions that would accompany this discovery. It's more complicated than that, David. Victoria didn't know about your situation until she saw us together in the plaza outside her building. She's been trying to find your mother for years, but your mom had changed her name and left no way to be contacted. If she wanted to find us so badly, why didn't she try harder? David demanded, tears beginning to flow down his cheeks. My mother died because she couldn't afford proper medical care, and I ended up living on the streets. If my aunt is so wealthy, why didn't she help us when we needed it? Maria had stopped practicing piano and was listening to the conversation with wide eyes, unsure whether she should leave the room or stay to support David. James gestured for her to remain, knowing that David would need all the family support he could get during this difficult conversation. Your aunt has been carrying guilt about your mother's situation for 25 years, James said. She made mistakes when they were younger, mistakes that contributed to the family separation. When she found out about you and what you'd been through, she was determined to help. But she wanted to do it in a way that respected your right to choose your own path. By lying to me? David asked, his anger now mixing with hurt confusion. By pretending to be a stranger while secretly controlling my life? By making sure you had a stable, loving home with people who cared about you for who you are, not because of family obligations or guilt, James corrected gently. Victoria could have approached you directly, but she was afraid that you'd reject help from a relative you'd never met, especially one connected to family conflicts you didn't understand. David was quiet for several minutes, processing the revelation and trying to reconcile his feelings of betrayal with his gratitude for the stability and opportunities he'd gained over the past 6 months. Finally, he looked up at James with eyes that seemed even older than they had during his time on the streets. Does she want to meet me? David asked quietly. Does she want to be part of my life, or is she just trying to ease her guilty conscience? She very much wants to meet you and be part of your life, James replied. But only if that's what you want too. You're not obligated to have a relationship with her just because she's family, and you're not obligated to be grateful for help that came with deception attached. Can I think about it? David asked. This is a lot to process, and I need time to figure out how I feel about everything. Of course, James said, pulling David into a gentle hug. Take all the time you need. And remember, no matter what you decide about Victoria, nothing changes about your place in this family. You're our son and brother, and that's permanent. 2 weeks later, David told James that he was ready to meet Victoria, though he wanted the meeting to take place in familiar surroundings with James and Maria present for moral support. Victoria agreed immediately, understanding that David needed to maintain as much control as possible over the circumstances of their first proper introduction. Victoria arrived at James's apartment on a Saturday afternoon, carrying gifts she'd chosen carefully: books about science and engineering for David, art supplies for Maria, and a bottle of wine for James. She was more nervous than she'd been before any corporate negotiation or board presentation, knowing that this meeting would determine whether she'd have the opportunity to build a relationship with her nephew. David answered the door when Victoria knocked, and for a moment, both of them simply stared at each other. Victoria saw Catherine's eyes looking back at her, along with facial features that reminded her of their father and their grandfather. David saw a woman who looked nothing like the cold corporate executive he'd imagined, someone whose obvious anxiety suggested that this meeting was as important to her as it was to him. "Hello, David," Victoria said quietly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "Hello, Aunt Victoria," David replied, the title feeling strange on his tongue. "Please come in." The initial conversation was stilted and formal, with both David and Victoria struggling to navigate the complexity of their situation. James and Maria helped fill the awkward silences, asking questions and sharing stories that gradually began to break down the barriers between aunt and nephew. As the afternoon progressed, Victoria began sharing memories of Catherine during their childhood. Stories that painted a picture of David's mother as a spirited and compassionate young woman who'd always championed underdogs and fought for causes she believed in. "She sounds like she was an amazing person," David said, his anger beginning to soften as he learned more about his mother's character and motivations. "I wish I could have known her before she got sick, when she was still fighting for the things she cared about." "She was fighting for the things she cared about right up until the end," Victoria replied. "Her most important cause was raising you to be the kind of person who would make a positive difference in the world. From what I can see, she succeeded." David smiled, the first genuine smile he'd directed toward Victoria since her arrival. "She used to tell me that the measure of a person wasn't how much money they had or how famous they were, but how they treated people who couldn't do anything for them in return." "That sounds exactly like something Catherine would say," Victoria said, her own smile matching David's. "She always believed that true wealth came from relationships and experiences rather than material possessions." As the visit continued, David began asking questions about the Carter family history, about his grandparents and other relatives he'd never known existed. Victoria answered honestly, acknowledging the family's wealth and social position, while also discussing the personal costs of prioritizing business success over emotional connections. "I spent so many years focused on building the company and accumulating wealth that I forgot how to build relationships," Victoria admitted. "Losing Catherine taught me that money can't buy back the opportunities you miss to connect with people who matter to you." "Is that why you helped me?" David asked. "To make up for losing my mother?" Victoria considered the question carefully, wanting to give David an answer that was both honest and complete. "Initially, yes. I felt guilty about the role I played in Catherine's decision to cut ties with our family, and I wanted to do something to honor her memory by helping her son." She paused, looking directly into David's eyes. "But it became much more than that once I started learning about who you are. You're not just Catherine's son or my responsibility to fulfill. You're an extraordinary young person with your own talents, dreams, and potential. I want to be part of your life because I genuinely care about you and because I think we could have a meaningful relationship." End quote. David was quiet for a moment, processing Victoria's words and trying to gauge their sincerity. Finally, he asked, "What would that relationship look like?" "I'm happy living here with James and Maria, and I don't want that to change." "I don't want it to change either," Victoria replied quickly. "James and Maria have given you something I never could. A loving family environment where you're valued for who you are rather than what you might become. I would never want to disrupt that. But I would like to spend time with you regularly if you're interested. I'd like to learn about your interests and goals. Maybe help with educational opportunities or experiences that interest you. I'd like you to know that you have extended family who cares about you and wants to support your future." David looked to James for guidance, and James nodded encouragingly. "It sounds like Victoria wants to be the kind of aunt that many kids wish they had," James said. "Someone who can offer different perspectives and opportunities while respecting the family relationships you've already built." "I think I'd like that," David said slowly. "But I want to take it slowly, and I want to be able to change my mind if it doesn't feel right." "Absolutely," Victoria agreed. "This is entirely your decision, and it will continue to be your decision as we go forward." As Victoria prepared to leave, David surprised everyone, including himself, by stepping forward to give her a hug. It was brief and somewhat awkward, but it represented a beginning rather than an ending. "Thank you for helping me when I needed it most," David said quietly. "And thank you for letting me choose how I want our relationship to develop. Thank you for giving me a chance to be part of your life," Victoria replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud of the young man you're becoming." Over the following months, Victoria and David began building a relationship that honored both his need for stability with James's family and his curiosity about his extended family heritage. Victoria attended David's science fair presentations and school performances, celebrated his academic achievements, and gradually introduced him to opportunities that expanded his horizons without overwhelming his routine. For his 12th birthday, Victoria arranged for David to spend a day at a research laboratory where scientists were working on renewable energy projects, allowing him to see real-world applications of the concepts he'd been studying in school. David was fascinated by the experience and began talking about potential career paths in environmental science and engineering. "I want to do work that helps solve climate change and makes the world better for future generations," David told Victoria during one of their regular Saturday afternoon visits. "My mother always said that the best way to honor your blessings is to use them in service of others. That sounds like a perfect way to combine your intellectual gifts with your mother's values," Victoria replied. "And I'd be happy to help you explore educational opportunities that could prepare you for that kind of career." The conversation took place in Victoria's office, where David had become comfortable enough to visit regularly. The imposing corporate environment no longer intimidated him, and he developed friendships with several of Victoria's employees who enjoyed discussing science and technology with someone so genuinely enthusiastic about learning. James had been promoted to a facilities management position within Carter Industries, a role that paid significantly more than his janitorial work, while still allowing him to maintain the flexible schedule he needed for his family responsibilities. The promotion was based on his demonstrated reliability and problem-solving skills, though Victoria's recommendation hadn't hurt his prospects. "I've been thinking about something," David said during that same conversation. "I want to establish a scholarship fund in my mother's name to help other kids who are struggling with poverty and family difficulties. I know I'm too young to do it now, but maybe when I'm older and have my own career established." Victoria felt a surge of pride in her nephew's compassion and vision. "That's a beautiful way to honor your mother's legacy. When you're ready to pursue that goal, I'd be honored to help you make it happen." As David approached his 13th birthday, he'd grown several inches and filled out considerably from the gaunt child Victoria had first observed from her office window. More importantly, he'd developed the confidence and security that came from knowing he belonged somewhere and was valued by people who cared about him. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. David had struggled with nightmares and anxiety during his first year with James's family, and there were moments when his fear of abandonment threatened to overwhelm his ability to trust in his new circumstances. But with patience, consistency, and professional counseling support funded by Victoria, David had learned to believe in the permanence of love and family. On a crisp autumn evening, 2 years after their first meeting in the plaza, James and David returned to the fountain outside Carter Industries. It had become a tradition for them to visit the spot where their lives had intersected, a reminder of how a simple act of kindness could transform multiple lives in ways no one could have predicted. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if we hadn't met that night?" David asked, settling on the familiar fountain edge where he'd once desperately searched for food in garbage cans. "Every day," James replied honestly, "but not with regret. I think about how grateful I am that we found each other when we both needed family most." Victoria watched them from her office window, as she had so many times before. But now, instead of observing strangers, she was watching her nephew and the man who'd become like a brother to her, two of the most important people in her life. The plaza below was the same, but everything else had changed in ways that made her believe in the possibility of redemption and second chances. David looked up at the towering building and waved toward Victoria's window, knowing she would be watching. In that moment, all three of them understood that some stories don't have endings, only new chapters that build on the foundation of love, courage, and the willingness to help others when they need it most. The hungry boy who had once dug through trash for survival now dreamed of changing the world through science and compassion. The single father who had shared his last sandwich now managed facilities for one of the city's most successful companies while raising 2 children who adored him. And the powerful executive who had spent years regretting past mistakes now knew the joy of being someone's aunt, someone's family, someone who mattered in ways that had nothing to do with wealth or corporate success. James's simple act of generosity had indeed become the catalyst for a chain of events that altered all their lives. But more than that, it had proven that the most profound changes often begin with the smallest gestures of human kindness, offered without expectation of reward or recognition. In a world that often seemed divided by differences in wealth, status, and circumstance, they had created a family bound together by love, hope, and the understanding that everyone deserves the chance to belong somewhere safe and be valued for who they truly are.